Good morning. Good morning. All right. It works. And we know we've taken about 8 weeks to try to get my volume figured out. So if everyone can hear me, good stuff. If somebody cannot, please just wave and we'll elevate it. Okay. All right. I got a thumbs up in the back, so we'll go with that for sure. So as I think most people who have been here the last 2 weeks know, I have not been here the last 2 weeks. So, special thanks to Keith and to Brady for filling in. And before we get started with today's lesson, just something that I thought about while listening to both of them over the last 2 weeks, in addition to just, something that happened yesterday. It's interesting. So, I know Wednesdays we're talking about spiritual disciplines. Relatively recently, I taught a similar type class in the upstairs room, and there's a lot of similarities, I think, with at least where I've attempted to take this quarter and having conversations with Keith. There's some overlap, just in principles. And what's interesting to me, something that resonated with me when I actually studied for a previous quarter, was this concept of discipline and this concept of oftentimes the folks that have a perceived freedom or a perceived ease with which they do things, those are the folks that are actually, in fact, the most disciplined. So an analogy would be someone like a Michael Jordan, right? So for those of you who are sports fans or basketball fans, I think most everyone in this room, even if you're not, he transcended excellence to a degree that most folks that even aren't sports folks at least know that name. And if you watched him, there was an artistry associated with his play, the execution with which he ultimately executed his craft. But I think if anyone is aware of his story, you're aware of the fact that he practiced like no one else. He was relentlessly focused and disciplined in honing his craft. He took time to learn the fundamentals so that when he did reach a point of mastery, it almost looked as though the fundamentals weren't a part of his game, right? Because he was that much more elegant. You could take an analogy in music and look at the life of Mozart. A lot of folks would perceive an individual like that, and he was a prodigy. I mean, he was very good from a very young age, but he was still very practiced from that young age. And there's a concept here that, at the very least, I started thinking about it a little bit more even this week, and really, again, it's something that has been a thought throughout the tenor of this class, but particularly as we explore commitment to understanding and we take a look at this even on the heels of the last 2 weeks and what transpired, it's something that, I'm thankful for a little bit of the irony. And what I mean by this is I had expected to be out 2 weeks ago. I talked with Keith, and I was traveling for work, and unfortunately I was not in the state a couple of Sundays ago. But what's interesting is, and I appreciate him talking about a commitment to sovereignty, a commitment to authority, and it's something that we'll continue to explore. But last week was unexpected. I was actually pretty under the weather, and had a conversation with Keith to make sure that we were okay. And I was watching from the TV, I suppose, watching from the house. Nobody wanted to see me last Sunday, rest assured. And I saw Brady get up there, and I was like, we may have clicked on the wrong link. It's probably not the correct Sunday. And come to find out, obviously, there was a switch at the last second. But what's interesting to me was, number one, Keith asked Brady a question. Do you want the fourth graders or do you want the auditorium? Equally as interesting, he chose the auditorium. For me, that choice would have been very easy, and I would have looked foolish in front of a couple of fourth graders as opposed to looked foolish in this room. But it's a testament to the congregation that we have, to the folks that are capable in this room and throughout this congregation. The fact that someone can execute in just a couple of days, like Keith did a couple of weeks ago, or someone can execute within a couple of minutes, the way that Brady did last week. It's a testament to the men that they are, the men that we have in this congregation, and their discipline that's unique in particular. I've had the good fortune to teach quite a bit over the years. This class has uniquely made me nervous for whatever reason. I don't know why. And I know that's kind of unconventional. Folks, I've actually gotten feedback, don't say that. You don't need to disclaim this stuff. And I do understand that there's a time and a place, but I share with you only for the purpose of understanding that if anyone is in this room questioning whether or not you should give it a try, much to the chagrin maybe of the audience, you today, it's at least a blessing for the teacher if you do ultimately decide to give it a try. And I hope that at some point in my faith walk and my spiritual maturation, I can do it with limited notice and without getting so amped up that I can hopefully come to the need of another teacher at some point in the future. So again, an elongated thank you, but just wanted to point that out, because those are things that are small things, and those are things that frankly, maybe have already been forgotten, or for most of us, and certainly for me, if I wasn't the one teaching, those are things that are forgotten in weeks and months and certainly years, but they're the small things that add and accumulate to become really big things. And, preaching or teaching, it's a gift that, or it's an opportunity that, the irony is most of the time, it's not always lasting. But just if it touches a few people, and it touches a few people in the way that folks have touched me over the years, it really does make it worth it, and it's a testament to the providence and the divine plan and will of God that we have this setting on a week-to-week basis. So, with that, let's continue our study towards a commitment to right, and let's look at, specifically this week, a commitment to understanding. So, there we are. So, we've explored a lot of concepts over the last several weeks, the last 8 to be exact. We've explored the concepts of justice and love, and really explored those two dynamics, particularly in the relationship that God has in and of himself. This dualistic nature of the nature of God. These two things that cannot exist exclusive to one another. But what's interesting is, as we continue to explore the relationship that God has in and of himself, it's a window to explore the relationship that we're called to have with our Creator, with the triumphant God, with the three natured persons of God, Father, Son, and Spirit. We then looked at Christ and his role specifically in a reconciliation that occurred between God and us, and really pitched it over to Keith, who talked about the authority of Christ and of God and our subjection to that authority. He referenced Deuteronomy 10, which is, a component of what we've explored for most weeks this quarter, walking with God, serving God, and loving God with all fiber of our being, mind, heart, soul, and spirit. Then we we had the opportunity to learn from Brady last week, particularly within the concept of a commitment to holiness. Holiness is a concept that, stated another way, sanctification or set apart. It's important for us to grasp a concept like holiness because we're called to be godly and we're called to be holy. We're called to be set apart the way that God is set apart from all other things that aren't perfectly good. Good being encapsulated with these concepts of both justice and love. And this week, what we'll do is we'll continue to layer on top, one by one, these concepts and hopefully grasp a better understanding of how these work collaboratively with one another, and hopefully how it moves us to have it manifest in the way that we live our lives, the actions and the outputs that we exude, and ultimately the commitment that we're called to have to do it each and every day, not just on the first day of the week or during Wednesday evenings or during certain settings of our lives, but each and every day in any setting that we find ourselves in. So, we talked a little bit, and these have been kind of proof texts throughout throughout the quarter, particularly this fear of God that's healthy and reverent, and the call that we're to have based on this healthy and reverent fear. And this call is manifest in a keeping of commandments, a subjection to, again, ultimate and divine authority. And what's interesting is Brady talks specifically in 1 Peter and in James, both chapter 1, 1 Peter 1, 13 through 16, and James 1, 26 and 27 specifically, talking about this idea of a call to purpose, this action that manifests itself in holiness, and what that ultimately looks like through pure and undefiled religion, namely in the bridling of our tongue and watching the things that we say and the things that we do, the outputs of our faith, if you will, and by taking care of those who are unable to take care of themselves. Fundamentally, it's, again, these concepts of mishpat, teskada, these concepts of justice and righteousness that continue to permeate all throughout Scripture. So we're going to spend most of our time in two places today in particular. When we talk about this understanding, keep in mind that it's an understanding of mind, it's an understanding of action, and it's an understanding that has a heart component to it, just like so many of the other concepts that we've explored throughout this quarter. But what's interesting is, through Isaiah, a book that we're, I think, mostly more familiar with versus maybe places that we've spent the majority of this quarter, whether it be Micah or Amos or Hosea or Zephaniah. Isaiah is what scholars would refer to as a major prophet. So we have these minor prophets, or the 12, and then you have 4 major prophets that are responsible for writing 5 books of the Old Testament. But what's interesting is the message is so similar. And what I mean by that is, you can see in this slide, and I purposely did, put it into a 1-slide format. Hopefully it's big enough. I think it still is font 36, which is right on the cusp. But what's interesting is you still have this tenor and this pattern of judgment and accusation for not living rightly, for not having a commitment to live rightly over a sustained period of time. But you still have this hope, and you have this response by God that the judgment will bring forth destruction, but it's destruction with a purpose, and that purpose is purification. Now again, a lot of this seems repetitive and redundant, but it is. This concept is as important as any concept found within our scriptures in the Old Testament or the New Testament. And with with a greater comfort, at least I am of the opinion, for what it's worth, with greater comfort with these Old Testament texts, our understanding and context of the New Testament scriptures that we're oftentimes much more familiar with become enhanced with their meaning. So there's two concepts, if we want to get into fancy words. Some folks don't care to, some folks really like it. So we're going to go with the latter for right this second. But there's two concepts that I'd ask that you be familiar with, to exegete a passage and to eisegete a passage. What I'd encourage us to do as Christians today, living in 2023, is to exegete a passage to the extent that we have the capability to. What that word means is to understand the context to its original audience, because that gives us an objective grounding in what this text ultimately meant to its original audience. Now, there's an application. We can get into another fancy word, hermeneutics, but there's this concept of understanding what the text was saying there and then so that we can have an appropriate application to what it means to us today in the here and now. But so often, and I think, again, painting it with the broadest of brushstrokes, but if you've ever asked yourself the question, why are there so many denominations? Why are there so many differentiations even across the Christian faith? I think fundamentally it comes down to interpretation principles. And it's very easy. Keith mentioned several weeks ago an individual who would have a daily Bible study dictated by having the book, her particular Bible, open to a page, pointing and seeing what that verse had to say, and give a direct interpretation of what that verse means to her life today. I think that doing that exclusively can give us an incorrect interpretation of what Scripture ultimately states. And so there's a balance in everything, and what I am not suggesting is that everyone needs to be a Bible scholar. I would profess to you that unequivocally I am not, so if that's the litmus, we've got a serious problem, or at least I do. But I think the litmus, if you'll indulge me for just a couple of seconds, is yourself yesterday. This is something that's something that I'm very passionate about because it's something that I've struggled with in my faith walk. No different than referencing Keith and Brady to begin the class. These are folks that, I look up to. And there's a handful of folks that I really have looked up to, mentors, if you will. And I think that those in anyone's life are tremendously important. But I think it can be unhealthy as a young person, as a middle-aged person, and as a person whose most years are in the rear view. If you have these mentors or you have these folks that you look up to, but that's your litmus, I think you're doing yourself in your faith walk a disservice. We all have different gifts, but we're called to apply most constructively the gifts that we've been blessed with. We've also been called to challenge ourselves to develop certain disciplines and principles that may not be a gift, but something that can be refined and can become a gift through practice and discipline. But I think the point ultimately is, if we're looking at moving forward, there is, by definition, a necessity to move. So if we're not moving forward and we're not maturing and we're not weaning ourselves off of milk and working on solid foods, by definition, we're going backwards. And we're not weaning ourselves off of milk. And so if we're called to grow and we're called to move forward, and that's as fundamental to our faith walk as anything ultimately is in terms of things that we control. It's a testament to the elders. It's a testament to the subject matter content that we're discussing really for the better part of this past year in particular. But it's how are we manifesting our understanding? And so Bible study is just one component of it, but it's a really important component of it, because the more you know, the more it becomes alive, the more it resonates with us. And it's been an incredible encouragement to me to hear some of the feedback based on, hey, I didn't realize that. And the so what here is, the more that we realize and the more that it's enhanced, the more fortified our faith ultimately becomes. I asked a mentor of mine, a teacher in college, I asked this person, why does it seem as though a lot of the trials that you go through as a young person? It would be better to go through some of the things, even in terms of your physical development. It would be, or your emotional development. It would be so nice to go through so much of the adversity that occurs just by growing up when you had more maturity and when you had more wisdom. And he sat there, and most of you probably already know what the gentleman told me, but it was profound to me at that time. But he said, Kyle, how do you think you get wisdom? And so, again, talking about the divine providence of God and understanding what it takes to fortify a Christian and to live a life, if you've been born and raised in the church and you have the opportunity to live a full life faithfully to God, there's a peace that can be found in that does surpass all understanding. Conversely, if you found God at a point in your life that was later, there's a peace that passes all understanding with the full appreciation of what your life was before and what your life is today. And so the challenge is to myself, first and foremost. Brady referenced last week that oftentimes the preacher or the teacher is preaching or teaching to himself. And as you all, I think, are aware at this point, that is certainly the case in this class. But the challenge is before us to enhance our understanding, to continue to move forward, and to really grasp the solid food. And so with that in mind, let's continue to explore within the book of Isaiah, in chapter 6 in particular, a really important scripture that will then give us a jumping off point when we jump into the Gospel of John. But again, before we jump, what's interesting about Isaiah, just as an aside, is chapters 1 through 39 are written by Isaiah. That much we can feel very confident in. Chapters 40 through 66, unlikely to have been written by Isaiah. There's a 200-year gap, 190 to 200-year gap between chapters 39 and chapters 40. There's a pretty important event that occurs as well, the Babylonian exile. And so the next time you're studying through the book of Isaiah, just keep in mind that chapters 1 through 39, a lot of warnings, a lot of accusations, and we'll see in chapter 6 in particular, the specific context is King Uzziah has just passed. And so you have this brief rule of a king who was okay, and then you jump into the rule of King Ahaz, and then you jump into the king Hezekiah. But what's important, particularly with the rule of Ahaz, was he was a very wicked king. And so most of this is an indictment of past sins and also current sins, this rapid descent, because Uzziah was a relatively faithful king. And so, again, you have this roller coaster that Israel and that Judah are going through, right? That God's people are going through from the highest of levels. And so when you read through where exactly the nation in particular of Judah is, when we're looking at chapters 1 through 39, just keep in mind that all the way really up until, maybe the last 10 chapters or so, you've really got this descent, this increased wickedness throughout the country. And so you see also this pattern that it's judgment that is to Jerusalem, really first and foremost, because with great responsibility, or with great power comes great responsibility, or great relationship dynamic, there's an enhanced call. God is very clear that he holds his people to a higher standard because they are his people. I think that standard is something that prevails today. Sin is sin, truth is absolute. But we know God. And there's a responsibility that comes with that understanding. And so what I challenge folks to just kind of look at and explore is some of the Christ prophecies in the beginning, because even in chapters 1 through 39, where you have a lot of warning and a lot of maybe negativity, you still have this glimmer of hope. You still have a change in pace, if you will, even when you know exile is on the horizon. And then chapters 40 through 66, that dynamic kind of flips, and you get a lot more hope, you get a lot more promise, you get a lot more pointing towards a fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, but basically that all nations will be blessed through a remnant, through a seed, through Christ in particular, who will sit on the throne of God forever. And that in turn, the people that serve God will serve him faithfully. And so what I just did there was it's a reference to the Davidic covenant in the kingship of Christ. It's a reference to the Mosaic covenant and that his people will truly be his people. And it's a reference to the Abrahamic covenant that all nations will be blessed through this Christ King and through a holy nation in this world and in the next. And so, as we continue to look at the structure, what I'd like to also just point out is Isaiah 52 and 53, very well-known passage of the suffering servant. We referenced it 3 weeks ago because we talked about specifically this reference to the suffering servant being bruised. That bruising, that bruising of the heel versus the crushing of the head of the evil one, that's a reference to that seed promise, the very first promise that God makes when the fall of man occurs. Well, a really powerful passage, if you'd like to, we can turn to Isaiah 42. So this is actually the first of 4 servant songs. So 52 to 53 is a culmination of actually 4 different servant songs that point to a suffering servant, a Messiah, a king that is of a different flavor, if you will, than the one that they're really looking for. Let's look at the first servant song, starting in chapter 1 of verse 42. Behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry aloud or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a faintly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be discouraged, but he will have every reason to, right? Till he has established justice in the earth, and the coastlands wait for his law. And in verse 5, it shifts from a tenor and even the speaker. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord. I have called you, his people, in righteousness. I will take you by the hand and keep you. I will give you as a covenant to the people, a light for the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon and from the prison who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to carved idols. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I declare before they spring forth. I tell you of them. God is faithful, and we're called to be faithful to him. So with that, from a context standpoint, let's turn back to Isaiah 6. And for those of you who are familiar with this passage, it's a really neat passage because it gives one of the few glimpses into God's fullness in terms of what the glory from a heavenly perspective and how it's ultimately made manifest. So let's start in verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, so again, faithful king has passed. We are starting a descent, or in the midst of a descent. I suppose maybe Joash was the most faithful of this remnant, but we're in a continued and even more rapid descent. So starting in verse 1 again. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. So seraphim, an angel, a divine and magnificent creature. That magnificent really kind of teeters that line of so magnificent, it may very well be terrifying. Verse 3. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. So it's important here. You see this in the life of Christ. Oftentimes it's not 3, most times it's 2, whether it's truly, truly, or verily, verily. But I know it's kind of Captain Obvious stuff, but when you really get a 3 times over emphasis, it truly is something that is unique. And when we look at holy as a concept and as a term in and of itself, this idea of being sanctified and set apart and awesome, and to have it repeated 3 times, you get these pictures all throughout Scripture where God makes himself known to an audience, to an individual or to a group of people, but they can only see it if they're looking. This is not one of those occasions. This is an occasion where it reminds me a little bit of the scene that the final judgment, I think, will take on. Just from the perspective of everybody at a point in time will acknowledge that the Lord is God. And so I think a manifestation here in the form that Isaiah saw, it's much more in the form of the latter than the former, of the 2 ways that God can make himself known. Go to verse 4. And the foundations and the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, I being Isaiah, woe is me, for I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Now again, you have this terror that Isaiah ultimately is experiencing. He's familiar with the story of Moses when he caught a glimpse of the backside of God. He's familiar with Moses' instruction when from afar the nation saw God's presence on Mount Sinai. They saw the rolling of the mountain and the thunder and the smoke and the fire and the holy presence and powerful presence of the sovereign God. Isaiah, frankly, has just experienced this scenario, and he feels this visceral reaction, this immediate reaction that it's a death sentence, But what's interesting is what comes next. In verse 6, then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth and said, behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. So what's interesting here, and you noticed in the previous slide, we had some text in blue font. In this slide, you have some text in purple font. But what's interesting to note here is two ways that man has to make himself appropriate to be in the presence of God at this time. So most probably don't recall, and that's completely okay, but in the last class that I taught a handful of weeks ago now, we talked about this concept through the covenants, through the promises that occur between God and man. This concept that what Christ did uniquely different was, if the covenants in and of themselves were an opportunity for God to interact and have a relationship with his people, the difference between the new covenant and the covenants that ultimately it continued to make manifest and build upon was this concept that throughout the Old Testament, for man to be in the presence of God, two things had to happen. One, sins had to be atoned for, but also we had to be clean. This concept of clean versus unclean, it's actually a different concept than sin versus atoned sin. So you have the ceremonial cleanliness, you have this concept that's kind of a Jewish concept of normality or wholeness. It's the same concept that I think is manifest in the perspective of God demanding the best sacrifice, the best animal. It's kind of the equivalent of putting your Sunday best on today, maybe. A very unofficial, it's not biblical, it's just an analogy. But the point is, for someone to enter into presence, something had to occur. A willful subjection that ultimately manifests in obedience because of the law that was given and all of these instructions that made someone clean versus an unclean state. But what's interesting is the seraphim not only takes care of his cleanliness, but also his sins. So Isaiah is appropriately in the presence of God. Skip down to verse 8. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, here I am, send me. You have a lot of reluctant prophets throughout Scripture. It's encouraging to know that Isaiah was not one of them. And he said, go and say to this people, keep on hearing but do not understand, keep on seeing but do not perceive. Make the heart of his people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. Lest is this concept of for fear that. There's a little bit of a rhetorical, a little bit of, if you can believe it, sarcasm. He's saying that you tell Israel that they're doing these things, but they're not doing them with the right intent. They're doing it with the wrong heart set. But you can tell them that they could change and actually yield a different result. Not only are their outputs pure, but their inward heart is pure as well. Verse 11, then I said, how long, O Lord? And he said, until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and land is desolate waste, and the Lord removes people far away, and forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. Verse 13 is really important, because it's a continuation of a theme that we've explored throughout the entire quarter. And though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. So you see the picture, this concept of a terebinth, a Middle Eastern pistachio tree. But what's interesting is we're familiar with this oak analogy, strong as an oak. But you see so often, even when you cut a significant portion of a tree, if a tree is established or strong enough, like these two species speaking on the whole, you can actually have it's a water shoot really, but it's a growth that occurs, and given enough time, a tree can actually regrow from an area where it was completely decimated. So at first glance, you have this concept of Israel being reduced to a stump. It's dead and it's gone. But you have this offshoot, this remnant of the promise. And that's something that has been a tenor from the very beginning until today. Praise God, we are the remnant today. And so this is the concept that in this divine manifestation, God is giving to Isaiah so that Isaiah can take it to his people. And what's interesting is you can look at this culmination, and we'll explore it more next week, but this culmination that you see in the Gospel of John. We talked about a couple of weeks ago this concept of Christ taking on the form of the tabernacle, taking on the form of the temple, being a presence to God's people in a way that he makes the area around him clean, as opposed to us trying to temporarily do something for ourselves that's not sustainable or lasting. That's why we are called to have the submission to his authority, to his godness. And what's really neat, and we'll end here, but if you jump to John, chapter 2 in particular, starting in verse 23, now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many believed in his name, when they saw the signs that he was doing, but Jesus on his part did not entrust himself to them, because he knew all people and needed no one to bear witness about man, for he himself knew what was in man. So, teasing what we'll discuss more next week, by way of this understanding, is this concept of what John is doing here thematically, from a context standpoint, is he's laying the foundation, because what you'll see throughout the next several passages is a discourse between Jesus and some person. So we'll talk about Nicodemus in particular. We'll do a brief aside. We'll still incorporate the prophets. But what's really interesting about his exchanges with Nicodemus and with the Samaritan woman is these concepts of salvation and water, these concepts of light and dark. And all that I'd say in advance of next week is what John does such a good job of throughout his narrative, throughout his gospel account, is giving you depth that there's more than what meets the eye at first glance. So I'll tease it with this. Nicodemus meets Jesus at night. All right. Appreciate you guys. Take care.